Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Finding the Next Gear. Got Dr. Yishai back for, I think this is a tertiary meeting here. Thanks for joining.
Third time. It's been awesome, and I'm really excited to be back.
Yeah, no, always the discussions with you are always fascinating. And, to me, it's really interesting how psychology transcends, entrepreneurship. And it's such a big, big, big component on like your personality and how that can affect success, failure, et cetera. So thanks
Mhm.
for coming back. Really appreciate it. Prior to jumping into everything, if you can just give people kind of a quick reminder of who you are and some of your focus areas, I think that would be appreciated.
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Yishai Barakadari. I like to go by Dr. Yishai. So I'm a psychologist, licensed psychologist, and an adaptability expert, speaker. I also do coaching and consulting for entrepreneurs, leaders, and their businesses. And I have a host. I'm the host of a podcast called The Business Couch with Dr. Yishai, where psychology and business sit down to chat. So this is absolutely totally my wheelhouse. And I just love talking about this stuff, just so passionate about it. And I really draw on that background, the training and experience I have now over a decade of being engaged in psychology and psychological work to really kind of apply that to the business space, not in a way of being a therapist
Right.
to, the entrepreneurs or leaders, but rather to understand how psychology impacts every human touch point, whether it's for our clients or teams or ourselves as leaders.
I think it's great. I think it's such a novel idea as well. Again, I think psychology is such a big component to business, and
Hmm.
it's I think it's a missed opportunity if people aren't actively evaluating their psyche and how they're feeling, especially with
Hmm.
businesses. And I think today's discussion is pretty interesting to me in particular because it's centered around optimism. And
Hmm.
in order to get prepared for this call, I was doing a little bit of research, and there, it was a Forbes magazine, and they're talking about cognitive bias, and basically
Hmm.
optimism bias is a component to that. But essentially, they're talking about how entrepreneurship is ripe with optimism bias, and
Hmm.
essentially, most businesses are out of business by year five.
Hmm.
That happens from a slew of reasons. It could be from not having a good founding team, money issues, product market fit, etc.
Hmm.
But also a significant blind spot is this optimism bias, where essentially
Hmm.
these founders and these owners think, hey, yes, this happens to a lot of people, but it's not going to happen to me.
Hmm.
So this can be a significant blind spot. And so, love having you on for these conversations. And what I'm really interested in kind of learning out is how can you temper that and kind of find the golden mean where you're not overly, optimistic, but of course, you're
Hmm.
not the inverse, which is, the pessimistic side.
Yeah, I want to really dig into all those pieces. And I think the first thing we're going to need to do is actually back up and talk about what is optimism bias and what might contribute to it and what are the consequences of it. So, an optimism bias is where a person is thinking or imagining or treating the best possible case, the best possible scenario, as if that's exactly what's going to happen. So, the way that looks when it comes to business, as you were saying, is someone may start a business and they tell themselves, oh yeah, the vast majority of businesses might, need to shutter their doors and they end up losing money and they're not survivable within 5 years. But my business, what I'm going to do or how I'm going to approach it is going to turn out in this really wonderful, best possible case scenario type of way. Right. And again, I think some of this reminds me of an episode I did, episode 150 on my podcast, Entrepreneur Never Satisfied Syndrome, where I talked about how there are two kinds of entrepreneurs. There are futurists and there's solutionists. And they kind of work in two different ways. The analogy I use is it's kind of like MacGyver and Tony Stark, Iron Man, where the MacGyver, the solutionist, finds and figures out that there are all kinds of complex and simple and big issues, problems. Steve Sims likes to say, and I had him on my podcast also, he said that aggravation is the core of an entrepreneur. They get frustrated and aggravated about something so much that they figure out how to solve that problem for themselves and for others, and that births the business. And that's the solutionist approach to entrepreneurship, to having a business, to running a business. The other side of it is a futurist approach where you're envisioning something that could be better, that is better. And envisioning that takes a kind of mind and approach that says it could be better and I can make it better. And so that's the piece of it that connects to this optimism bias. And I think in a sense, it's not just that you're one or the other. It's not just to categorize, but it's kind of like we have a bit of both or we have some amount of each. And so when it comes to the optimism bias, what happens is someone might be so high on that futurist approach, on that kind of dimension, that the way they think about things is my imagination, the way I consider, the way I anticipate or expect things to go is in line with this vision or dream, and could even be a fantasy. And that's where people can get into trouble, because reality doesn't always line up with our vision. In fact, frequently it doesn't, right? And that's where the solutionist piece is really important. And that's where also being able to kind of handle some of that is. So, all of that was just to understand that optimism bias is about treating the vision for the future, or what could be, as if it already is, or is it as if that's the baseline or the expectation, rather than saying this is what it could be. And it might be the case that it takes a lot to get there, or it might not take the shape that I had envisioned it. And so the way to understand or recognize that as far as blind spots and mitigating that is to allow yourself to envision, to actually be intentional about envisioning, and then to take a step back and say, okay, is this the best case scenario? Is this the middle of the road? Is this the worst case scenario? Take a step back and acknowledge it. And, if you're going to write it down, if you're going to put it in a Word doc, or you're going to write it down in your journal, or, put it down on paper, or make your business plan, after you do that, take a step back and grab a pen and put at the top, is this the optimistic? Is this the pessimistic? Is this the realistic? Right? And take that step back and ask yourself really honestly. And that's not an easy thing to do. In fact, I think it's a good situation. It's a good suggestion, rather, to take a beat, to take a day or two to sleep on it, to come back to that and ask yourself that question again. Is this realistic? Has it happened yet? What would need to line up for it to happen? Could anything go wrong? If something did go wrong, what would happen? So when someone's in the optimistic space, what's really useful to do is to put that down, to let yourself have the whole vision, the whole dream. Don't try to cut it off at the knees, because if you do that, you can actually end up kind of kneecapping yourself and your business for where it could go. But the other side of that is that you don't want to treat it as if that's where the business absolutely will go, or where it is today.
I think that's a great point. It's all about kind of, you need to ground yourself, put yourself out of the clouds a little bit. And I really like kind of how you set that up, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. But when you're talking, the first thing I was thinking about was lottery tickets, right? And like I've been guilty of this as well, where you buy a lottery ticket and you convince yourself that you're going to win the $600 million jackpot,
right?
Like literally, and it's insane. It's insane. And like, I don't even know what the probability is of this, but it's like, absolutely less than 1%. And it's not going to happen. I mean, granted, it happens to somebody. They were right that one day, right? But like, you literally can convince yourself. And even with my business, when I started my business, I came up with this idea. It kind of evolved into something more. And then I was working on my business plan, and man, it was grandiose. The numbers. The first 3 months, I was already kind of replaced my salary, which was not the reality, and it was quite. I didn't realize how far off base I was, to be honest, with just my sheer optimism. Yeah. And I did a lot of this in a vacuum. Like it was me. I was working on a spreadsheet. I bounced numbers off people here and there, but it literally, there wasn't an exercise where I was trying to kind of ground myself a little bit. Now there's a flip side to that, where if I probably brought in too large of a committee, then maybe I would have, completely seen the inverse and become a complete pessimist, which that scares the hell out of me. And it serves a purpose. Right. But I feel like optimism suits one well in entrepreneurship, so long as you're not in the clouds. And that is just so hard to get a reality check. And it's something that I don't want to say I've struggled with per se, but I've done a pretty good job keeping myself grounded, I'd say, after I saw that my forecasts were completely inaccurate.
Yeah. And you bring up some really important points, which I think are so important. One that you brought up is, look, allowing our head to get into the clouds is actually very important to the entrepreneurship.
Yeah, you get creative. That's what I think the most.
Right. It's where you can generate something and it gets really exciting. And that's a huge motivator. In addition to that, if you didn't have that time period or that opportunity, if you didn't take that opportunity to envision a future that was just really amazing and awesome, that fulfilled the mission, right, of your company, of your business, then would you really have gotten it off the ground? And you talked about that by way of, if you're just so pessimistic, you're never going to get off the ground. So you need it to get lift, right?
Totally.
The other side of that, though, is not letting your head only be in the clouds. So, there's an old saying, there's a time for everything. And so there's a time for your head to be in the clouds. There's a time to be creative. There's a time to generate something new, exciting, and really, to dream and even fantasize and to imagine that it can be like that, right? The part of the challenge is, for example, the way you were talking about it is that timeline, thinking that in 3 months you were going to do that, as opposed to chances are it may have happened in reality, but it took just a lot longer.
Yeah, no, I mean, literally, if you look at the time horizon that I initially created, I'm like 3 years behind where I thought it would be, which, I'm not in a bad situation. Things are great. So it's literally, it was just, I was too optimistic, but I think you brought up a great point a second ago that if I didn't have that optimism, I never would have launched. I never would have jumped out of corporate America. And that's probably a safe thing to say about almost every single business out there. Some are born out of necessity. But others, right, would never have been created if there wasn't some optimism that, hey, I can do this.
Right.
And I can do it in a novel, new way. The flip side of that, going back to the pessimistic piece, I actually had this concept 2 years before I jumped out of corporate America. And I kept talking to people and they're like, oh, why would you jeopardize? You've got, good lifestyle, why would you inject that risk into your life?
Yep.
Like some people are already doing that, that's not an attractive business model. And honestly, it took me from this optimistic 33-year-old that was really excited about jumping out and getting this thing moving. It took me 2 years before I candidly, I think, built back the courage to jump out and say, hey, these people are naysayers, just because they have risk or they don't want to, do this type of thing doesn't mean that it doesn't work for me. But it really, it affected me in a profound way. And candidly, maybe it worked out the way it should have, because it helped guard me and maybe like I prepared the business plan, that much better outside of the forecasting. But it's crazy how you can literally experience those extremes where I'm going to change the world. And then, wow, this is a stupid idea.
And it's never going to happen.
What am I thinking?
Yeah. And what you're pointing out, that flip side, that pessimistic side, part of it is that the people around you couldn't really envision or imagine it. And it can be hard to if they haven't seen it before. And that might be the people who are around you. Have they had those kinds of experiences or not? But especially when an entrepreneur is entering into blue waters, a space where no one has entered before, or there very few have, then it's not something that other people have envisioned, even if you have people around you who have had lots of experience. And so it's really important to recognize some of those pieces. And as in addition to that, they're kind of dousing the fire the fire that had been growing came from this place of doubt, of uncertainty, of not really seeing or being able to see that road or that pathway there, or how that could be successful. And I think you alluded to something very important, which is that as a result of it, yes, it delayed your timeline 2 years. Perhaps it could have started sooner. However, something happened in those 2 years in your mind and in the business process, which is you built into the business more. You kind of armored up the business in a way. You bulletproofed the business in a certain way. Because of those doubts and concerns, you said, okay, how do I answer these doubts? How do I respond to this pessimism? How do I imagine or work through some of these potential worst case scenarios or things that might happen? How do I mitigate that risk? And that, I think, is where the pessimism really comes in. And again, I view this, and you said it before, as purposeful. They're each a tool. And if we try to ignore it, we can end up being dragged down by either one. We can get clipped like our Achilles heel, either by being too optimistic or pessimistic. However, it's not just being too much this way or too much that way. It's if we don't pay attention to or harness each of them, because that pessimistic side, that pessimistic piece, it's there to help understand and anticipate what could go wrong, and then to push your brain to consider and work on a strategy or a set of strategies to help mitigate or address that risk. And even if none of those strategies end up particularly working, what happens is you've already put yourself in a place where you're expecting, anticipating, and preparing for strategies and putting yourself in a mindset of engaging in strategies and critically thinking for when things do not go as expected in your business. And that's an incredibly powerful tool. Again, it needs context. So just like with the optimism bias and the kind of the exercise I encourage you to you listening to engage in, put all of those things down on a piece of paper. What could go wrong? How could that go wrong? Why might that go wrong? List out everything that could end up absolutely kneecapping your business. And then one by one, go through that and ask yourself, okay, what can lead to that? What can I do? How can I mitigate that? And working through that and building that into your business plan, whether or not any of those things come to pass, what you're doing is you're also sharpening a skill set, which is the solutionist skill set, right? You're learning how to MacGyver your business because you're expecting everything's going to fall apart and you're only going to have some duct tape, and who knows what else, a thumbtack or something, right? To piece it back together. And what you're doing is you're really honing an essential skill that I like to call that skill an adaptability skill, to really be able to pivot and to work around and to work through challenges, issues, and threats to your business. It's so important to harness that. And again, a lot of this is, how do you contextualize it? How do you not let one side or the other take over? And I will say, I think sometimes it's really hard to do that if you're just doing it alone. Doing these exercises can help. And having the right kind of support or support network, people you can turn to, people who can say, of course, you're thinking and experiencing this, and now what can you do? That's really powerful.
No, I think that's a phenomenal point. The pessimistic component, though, is so strong. I mean, it's so strong. I literally went from this space where I was going to change the world into like, I'm literally wasting the best years of my life trying to recreate the wheel, and able to work through it. And I think, mistake that I made was that the conversation that I was having was not with other entrepreneurs, right? It was with other individuals where that was, tremendous amount of risk. Entrepreneurship was for, and also too, there was no interest in it. And so I surrounded myself by, the people that, I couldn't relate to on that that level. And so, again, something I've learned is that, probably should have had conversations with entrepreneurs about the concept, and maybe that would have risen the optimism a little bit. Now, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here. So a lot of us, especially, entrepreneurs, we can be extremely optimistic about our businesses. We can become extremely heads down in our business. And then, of course, can lose some of that optimism, right? And that can be due to burnout, myriad of other reasons. This has been a really tough start of the year for me, just busy. And I'm unable to kind of think about my business strategically as much as I'd like. To me, that's where a lot of the optimism comes in. When I can think about my business, when I can think about it, what it could be, that's when I get really excited. Ideas start flowing, the optimism rises, and I feel like I make changes. But it's really hard to kind of get in that mindset, and it's really easy to get in a rut. And same thing happens to me creatively when it's time to write. I've got to be in the right mindset in order to start writing and be creative. So are there any tips, tricks that people can maybe work through, think through when they're maybe lacking some optimism, they're lacking that spark, and they're just kind of stuck in the slog and unable to lift their head up and, get creative again?
Yeah, I'm hearing it's a double-sided problem. So I'm going to point out all the pieces of that I'm hearing that I think are really important, because there's two problems here. One is stuck in the slog. And the other one is can't dream, struggling to dream, right? And those two things are going to need a double-sided solution.
Gosh.
Right? So I'm going to simplify it here. One is, when you're stuck in the slog, one piece of it is to recognize that, and sometimes especially for different businesses, every business is going to have a busier season.
Yes.
And a season that's less busy. And for some, that's really kind of predictable. For others, it might not always be so predictable. However, it's really important to recognize what your busy seasons are and when your times that have a little more freedom or leeway are. And as you can do that, especially if you can anticipate it, what you want to do is you want to bookend beginning and end.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. You want to bookend so you can anticipate and prepare for the busiest times. You also want to bookend because right before and after each of those, you want to dream. You want to dream before and you want to dream after.
So just to kind of interject, it's really interesting you say that because there's seasonality with my business for sure. The first year in business, it scared the hell out of me, honestly.
Mm.
But then year two is like, okay, this happened last year. Year three is like, okay, this is a pattern. So I've
Yep.
got a pattern, and I guess it slows down towards I think right around Thanksgiving, and then there's a spike kind of beginning December, and then it's really slow, which is great, and I've learned to really enjoy it. And candidly, to your point, and I guess I did this unbeknownst to myself, but that is when I am pretty creative, pretty optimistic. I can have some downtime and think about my business strategically for the next year. Conversely, when I hit January, that first month is always horrific, just in regards to the catch up, right? Everybody's scrambling. They're kind of, whether or not they're rested, they're back, and it's a new year. So you got to get moving. But I really like your perspective on how maybe I can do a better job of, anticipating the downtime and enjoying it. And more importantly, thinking to myself as well, like, hey, this is kind of what I signed up for. This is the pattern. You're busy in January, and that's actually a really good thing to be busy.
Yeah. It's another way of looking at that on a micro level. What people often say is take a little bit of time every day to do some thinking creatively about your business. But like you were saying, there are going to be seasons, moments, times in your business that you don't even have those 15 or 20 minutes. And if you do, you're shoveling food in your face or you're grabbing a cup of coffee because you're just go, 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 go. And it's okay to recognize if that's the case for you in your business. For some people, they're able to say, look, I'm going to intentionally slow down and stay and kind of hold back. And maybe I do less. Maybe my business doesn't grow as much as it could in that season. And some people can be intentional about that. For some, it's just the time to be hustling. And again, it's not for me to tell you who you are or any of you out there, right? What kind of entrepreneur you are, you get to make that choice. It's really about intention, and it's about seeing and knowing and understanding these patterns and then setting those intentions. So, if this is a double-sided problem where one side of it is you're stuck in the slog, well, not only is that not a bad thing, you can actually build your business and your timing around that and your way of approaching your business around that, so that you're dreaming before and you're dreaming after, right? You're creating a vision, you're expanding your idea of what your business can be, or you're kind of making tweaks in a very creative way to strategically, where do you want this business to go? The time to be thinking about that is not when you're in the middle of the slog, unless in the middle of the slog something huge happens that tells you have to make a hairpin turn or a really sharp pivot. But separate from that, it's really something that can wait until later. And you can remind yourself of that. And I would even say, if you know when it's going to slow down again, or the first moment you'll even be able to slow down, carve that time out, shove it in your calendar, be like, I'm going to take 2 hours on that day and I'm going to get to slow down. Maybe I'll just need to take a break and do a little bit of nothing, or just kind of step back from all the slogging. And maybe towards the tail end of that time, or the following day or the following time you book a 2-hour block for yourself, you say, or a 1-hour block, or even a half-hour block, right? Whatever time frame works for you. You say, okay, this is a time I'm going to let myself consolidate everything that I've been doing and think about where can I envision this going. And, it touches on something else, which is, in order to be adaptive, in order to be able to tap into this part of and being creative, we also need to have data. We need to understand patterns in our business. And the better we understand that, the less we're going to get hit kind of out of nowhere and really blindsided by it. So I think that's another really important piece. And it's not always easy to track, and we don't always recognize it, which again is where having support of someone whose job it is to understand that there are patterns and to help you recognize that is really useful, really helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. In fact, one of the things that I'm looking into right now is hiring a COO, or somebody that's kind of in charge of the ops piece, just that they can help with the identification, the overall management of kind of everything behind the scenes. So I can get back to the land that I like, which is optimism. Life is great, and we're going to change the world.
Yeah.
But that's super interesting, and I appreciate you kind of sharing the perspective on the slog, the patterns, and maybe how folks can better deal with the situation. Because I need to learn to embrace the busy season, because again, I had about 2 to 3 weeks where it was slow, and it was wonderful. but now I'm paying for it, and I think that's going to help me get through this week, Dr. Yishai. That's great.
Yeah. And one thing you can do in the future, it's so interesting to hear that, you had the 2 or 3 weeks and it was wonderful. And then the narrative, the story is that you're paying for it. Well, maybe it's the other way around. Perhaps especially when it comes to the future, you can say, I'm going to have a slow season followed by a slog season.
Right.
And how does that look like? And how can you set yourself up? It might be the case that if there are things that you can be intentional about expanding your bandwidth, what we're talking about, by the way, is also overwhelm. When we're talking about being in the slog in the middle of it, is that your kind of load is exceeding your limit. I like to say your carry exceeds your capacity. That's when overwhelm shows up. And that's what it's there to tell us to do and help us do. So if you can anticipate that when this slog season is coming, you can then say, how do I expand my capacity? How do I expand my ability to hold this? And how can I prioritize what pieces of what I'm carrying are going to need to be carrying are most important? How can I make sure that I'm dealing with the most important pieces first? And there's so many different strategies for that. I actually have, and I think we talked about it previously. I have a worksheet on overwhelm, and it has at least a half dozen or a dozen strategies on how to address that. And so much of this comes with being able to anticipate that, because the time where it's slower, what if you take or have a day or two where all you do is you plan and set up, and you really kind of put up the scaffold to hold up the structure. Right? You kind of really set up that foundation and scaffold so that when you need to do all of this, you got all the supports you need. Well, then that season is going to be busy, and it may not be quite as overwhelming. And then afterwards, you have the time to take down the scaffold and to look back over all of it, and to evaluate and then reevaluate. How did that season go? How can you set yourself up better for it next time? And then how can you look at the kind of broad nature of your business and where you want it to go? And how can you harness that? Is there another way to harness that? Or can you set yourself up in a different way? And what other patterns are coming up?
Sure. No, that makes sense. And please do share the sheet on being overwhelmed, because I feel like a lot of folks, particularly in the entrepreneurial realm, that's a feeling that's real. I mean, it really is. I'm up at 6 a.m. every morning, works a lot of the evenings, and throughout the day I'm busy, which again, good problem to have, but sometimes being overwhelmed, can be a real thing. And what I've also noticed, a kind of a recurring theme about the way you speak, and I appreciate that, is that it's writing it out and giving yourself the ability and some time to reflect, especially, we were talking about optimism bias. Are you in the clouds? Write it down, take a day, think through it. But I found I write out a lot of stuff myself, and I have found that does helps me find my chi, get recentered, refocused. And it could also be as simple as like, hey, why am I doing this? What are my priorities? What's my why? Writing things out is critical. And it's been a helpful tool for me personally. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I love it.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because it actually fits into a framework that I have. It's a really simple triple P framework, 3 Ps: pause, process, plan. Those 3 things: pause, process, and plan, right? And that's basically what I'm inviting you all to do when I say, slow down, grab a piece of paper or open up your laptop, right? And think. Right? Take the time to imagine. Let yourself get up into the clouds. Put it down on paper, right? There's a lot of processing that can happen. You can anticipate. Some of that's anticipatory. You're looking at patterns and how you want to deal with that in the future, or you're thinking about your future and envisioning the future of your business. The whole thing is, if you don't slow down and take the time, then there's no way that's going to happen. So that's the pausing. The processing is you sit down and you do that writing. Historically, and there's been a lot of really interesting research, and so many people get a lot out of journaling, and there's so many different ways to journal. Everything from a 2-minute journal, which is actually something that I have and do all the time, which is really quick. It can be 90 seconds on a morning or nightly basis. And that's what it is. The pause, process, plan can be as little as 90 seconds. That's the other thing. But there's so much real benefit to being able to journal, because it really helps you to process. And it's a way in which you are allowing yourself to pause. And as you do that, you start to recognize that processing helps you to start formulating a plan, and being intentional about that can absolutely set you up in a way to be more successful, or for growth, or for handling whatever has happened or is upcoming, and both really, in a way that can be much more helpful moving forward. So I like to call it the triple P treatment.
Like that.
Even though, it's obviously not, psychology treatment, but, giving it that pause, process, and plan. especially when we're in the midst of or in the middle of something. And again, I think another real benefit is you can structure it. You can be intentional and structure it in a way that can take as little as 90 seconds.
Sure.
It doesn't have to take 2 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. You don't have to do a 5-day retreat,
right,
to get at least some of that or some of the benefit of that.
Well, I think you should trademark the triple P. I think that's fantastic. And I totally agree as well. I feel like I'm in this reactive state these last few weeks, as I mentioned, just very, very busy. And I haven't given myself the opportunity to snap out of it. And I think that, putting some time on the calendar where it's a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes would be smart. I actually have those entries on my calendar. I just ignore them when I'm super busy. And that's to my detriment. So I've got like a 20-minute, I want to read for 20 minutes every day about business. And then, like 5 to 10 minutes where I'm thinking about my business with pen and paper. But again, those are the areas that I deprioritize typically when I'm super busy. And candidly, that's probably the reason that I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed this week with just all the work that I've got going on. So I love the perspective. I love the thought on just kind of taking some time to pause, process, and plan. And I think all of us could benefit from doing that. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And, I think as you were saying, being overwhelmed, I think is not just because we don't do the daily things, though that can contribute when the daily things help create more bandwidth for us, which often they do. But the flip side of that is sometimes, as you were saying, sometimes it is just that busy in your business that if you do take the 10 minutes to do some of that, or you take your 20 minutes to read and you take your 10 minutes to really think about and set your intentions, then at the end of the day, you still have a half hour of work that you didn't get to do that you're still going to have to do. And that might be at 1 a.m.
That's what the nights are for, man. Sometimes you got to hustle. This is the life I chose.
And so it can be important and helpful to be intentional about that. I think sometimes we also, I heard somebody once say, consistency can sometimes be a little overrated. And I think there's something really to that, because there might be a season in which it's actually beneficial to let go of that. However, it's different to let it go and pick it up. This comes back to the bookends concept, right? It's different to let it go at one point because or when you have something else that needs to take up your time and energy and effort. It's another thing to not pick it back up when you're exiting that time frame and setting yourself up for that. For example, by pausing, processing, and then planning for how you're going to pick it up at the tail end, at the other bookend. That's really powerful and empowering. And I think it also releases us from this idea that I have to do it every single day. Otherwise, I won't get there, or it's not going to be helpful. Well, it's one thing if, the season that's busy is 11 months out of the year, so you're only doing it for 1 month, versus when it's 1 month out of the year, or it's 2 weeks now, and then maybe 3 weeks at a later point in time, or even if it happens 3-4 times during the year. It's different when you put it down and pick it up versus thinking to yourself, I just have to do it literally every single day. That's so much pressure.
But that's so hard though. It's like working out, like I've got to do it every day. The second I stop doing it, stop eating healthy, it all falls apart. But that's a topic for another day. And
it is.
Sincerely appreciate you coming on, Dr. Yishai. How can people find you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So best place to find me, if you want to hear more and listen more, is the Business Couch with Dr. Yishai, my podcast. In addition to that, you can find me on LinkedIn and reach out to me there if you got any questions or if there's any way that I can be of further help or insight.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.